Some people aren't really listening to what you say. They are watching how you react. And there is a huge difference between these two things. Imagine the scene. Someone makes a seemingly small comment, maybe a review light, perhaps a provocation disguised as a joke, maybe a question that seems innocent, and then that person becomes silent. It's not just any silence, it is an observational silence. While you're thinking about what to answer, she's already analyzing something else. Your face, your tone, your hesitation, your discomfort. Because social manipulators don't make decisions based solely on what you say. They make decisions based on what your reaction reveals, and that changes everything. Many people imagine manipulation as something aggressive, direct, obvious, like someone pressing, insisting, controlling. But the most efficient manipulation rarely starts that way. It starts with observation, almost scientific, almost clinical. First comes a small test, something so subtle that if someone pointed it out as manipulation at that moment, it would seem exaggerated, a slightly disrespectful comment, an unexpected charge, a guilt thrown into the air, a criticism packaged in a tone of concern. Nothing big, nothing dramatic, just a test. And then the most important moment for those who are manipulating happens, the reaction. Maybe you've already experienced this without realizing it. Someone says something that takes you by surprise, and you try to explain quickly, or you laugh to avoid conflict, or you justify yourself too much, or you stay silent because you don't want to seem rude, or worse, you apologize for something you shouldn't even ask for. At that exact moment, something silent happens in the mind of whoever is watching. A calculation, a measurement, a map begins to form. And it's not about you as a person, it's about how far you can be pushed. This is uncomfortable to hear, but it's real. Experienced manipulators don't start with control. They start with reading, emotional reading, behavioral reading, limit reading. And here is something that few people realize. They don't need you to answer something specific. They just need to see how you react under light pressure, because the reaction delivers more information than any speech. Think about it a little. When someone makes a rude comment and you immediately try to explain yourself, what does this person learn about you? When someone invades a small boundary and you pretend not to notice, what does that mean? Signals? When someone blames you for something minor and you accept it to avoid tension. What a message silent is being sent. These reactions seem small, but for someone who strategically observes human behavior, they are data. And data creates patterns. Now here comes something even more unsettling. Many manipulators do not do this consciously in the traditional sense. They are not thinking in technical terms, but their brains learned something very early. Test, observe, adjust, and repeat. This is how certain dynamics begin, not with great abuse, but with small measurements. Have you ever noticed how some people make a strange comment and then immediately look at your reaction? It's no coincidence. It's reading. And often the entire conversation that follows depends on that first moment. Because if your reaction shows discomfort, guilt, a need to please, or fear of conflict, then something changes. The person's next step will be different, bolder, a little more invasive, a little more controlling. And if you think about it, maybe you've already felt this. The feeling that someone seems to be studying you during a conversation, as if trying to understand where the open door is. Where is the weakest limit? Where is the point where you give in? And the most curious thing, it's just that all of this can happen in extremely normal interactions, in casual conversations, in friendships, in relationships, even within your own family. Nothing seems dramatically wrong. But there is a quiet attention going on, constant observation of your reactions, because for those who manipulate well, the question is never just, what can I ask for? The real question is different. How far will this person allow? And the answer almost never comes from words. It appears first in the reaction. After the first reaction appears, something changes in the dynamics. The conversation continues. The words continue. But for those who observe human behavior strategically, interaction now has a starting map. Because manipulators don't just look for answers, they look for signs. Very small signs. Almost invisible. One more second of silence before responding. A smile that seems polite, but tense. A quick attempt to justify something that wasn't even asked for. And sometimes people don't even realize they did it. But those who are watching notice it. Here there is a very important psychological detail that almost no one talks about. Most people react emotionally first, and then think, this is human. This is normal. The problem is that, for someone who manipulates, this small emotional break is extremely revealing. This is where clues about fear of disapproval appear. Need to be accepted. Discomfort with conflict. Tendency to explain too much. Or difficulty setting limits. And the person testing you doesn't need a perfect analysis. She just needs direction. You just need to understand which way to push. Now think with me for a moment. When someone says something that makes you uncomfortable, what is your most automatic reaction? Do you confront? Do you explain? Do you try to smooth over the situation? Or do you change the subject to avoid tension? This question seems simple, but it reveals much more than it seems. Because manipulators pay attention precisely to this point. They watch who they try to please, who tries to justify, who tries to prove that they are a good person, and those who try to maintain harmony at any cost. These behaviors are deeply human. The problem isn't with them. The problem is when someone learns to use them as gateways. Imagine someone making a slightly unfair comment about you. Nothing too aggressive. Something like, "You always exaggerate things a little, right?" It looks small. But watch what happens next. If you immediately start explaining that you don't exaggerate. If you try to prove that you are being misunderstood. If you go into an effort to correct the person's perception, something silent happens in her mind. She realizes that a small push generates a big reaction. And that is information, lots of information. Another common situation. Someone makes an inconvenient request, not absurd, just uncomfortable. And you respond with something like, "It's okay, I'll manage," even if inside you don't want to. To many people, this seems like just politeness. But for someone who observes emotional boundaries, this is a clear sign. It means that avoiding conflict may be more important to you than protecting your own space. And that completely changes the game. Here comes a revelation that usually bothers. Manipulators rarely start by asking for something big. They start by asking for something small, because small requests test reactions. If the reaction shows resistance, they back off. If the reaction shows discomfort, but acceptance, they move forward. If the reaction shows guilt, then the door is open. It's almost like an experiment. One try. A reading. Now notice something curious. Many people believe that manipulators are overconfident all the time. But this is not always true. They are often also testing the waters, trying to understand who you are. What do you tolerate? Where do you hesitate? And what is your real emotional limit? Because there is a big difference between the limit that people say they have and the limit that they really defend when pressured. And it is precisely in this space that manipulation begins to take shape. When words say one thing, but reactions say otherwise. Have you ever noticed how some people make strange comments, and then they keep looking at you, as if they were waiting for something? It's not just curiosity, it's observation, it's emotional data collection. It's an attempt to understand how you work, because for someone who manipulates relationships, every little reaction is like a piece of puzzle, and when those pieces start to fall into place, the next step in the interaction is rarely random. It is adjusted, calculated, directed exactly to the type of reaction that the person has just discovered in you. There is something deeply uncomfortable when you begin to realize how certain people observe reactions. Because suddenly little things don't seem so little anymore. A cross comment, a strange joke, a criticism disguised as concern. Before, this all seemed like just imperfect social interaction. Now it starts to feel like measurement. And this is where many people have an uncomfortable realization. What they always considered just emotional sensitivity may have been interpreted by someone else as usable vulnerability. This doesn't mean that feeling too much is a problem. Quite the contrary. Empathy, emotional awareness, and the ability to care about others are qualities profoundly human. But for those who manipulate relationships, these qualities also work as signs that there is room for influence. Think of something simple. When someone unfairly criticizes you, what is your most natural reaction? Do you defend yourself firmly? Or do you try to explain calmly so that the person understands better? Many people do the second option, because they want to resolve the situation, because they want to be fair, because they want to be understood. But there is a curious detail. For someone who manipulates, an emotional explanation is not just an answer, it's information. It's like opening a window into your way of thinking, because as you explain, you reveal something about yourself. It reveals how much you care about being seen in a certain way. It reveals how much the other person's judgment weighs, reveals how much you are willing to invest emotional energy to correct a problem perception. And all of this becomes a map. Now imagine that someone says something slightly unfair about you. You explain yourself. The person listens. Don't argue much. Just watch. And then he changes the subject. At first glance, it looks like the situation is over. But maybe it's not over. Maybe it was registered. Because manipulators don't need to win arguments. They just need to understand reactions. And here comes something that few people realize. Many manipulative interactions are not confrontations. They are experiments, small tests, comments placed in the environment to see what happens. And if the reaction shows that you try to correct, explain, or prove something, that's enough to learn about you. There is a common pattern in this type of behavior. First comes a small stimulus, then comes observation, then comes silence. This silence is important, because in it the person observes details that go unnoticed by the majority. Your look, your posture, your tone of voice, the speed with which you respond, and sometimes even something more subtle, the way you try to maintain harmony in the conversation. Many people do this without realizing it. They try to fix the climate. They try to ease the tension. They try to make sure no one is uncomfortable. But for those who manipulate, this behavior can mean something very specific. It means you might be willing to carry a little more emotional weight to avoid conflict, and that, for certain people, is an opportunity. Now comes an important revelation. Manipulators don't have to be right about you. They just need to test. If the test confirms the hypothesis, they move forward. If it doesn't confirm, they change their approach. But the process continues. Test, observe, adjust, test again. And this can happen over the course of weeks, months, even years. Without it seeming dramatic, no screaming, no major confrontations. Just small interactions that reveal who you are when you're under pressure social. Maybe you've felt this at some point. The feeling that you need to over-explain who you are, or prove that you didn't do something wrong, or make sure the other person doesn't think anything negative about you. If this has already happened, stop for a moment. Because there is an important question hidden there. Why did that person's opinion carry so much weight at that moment? This question is not to generate guilt. It is to generate awareness. Because manipulators are extremely attentive to people trying to preserve the image of a good person at any cost. Not because it's wrong, but because it creates a predictable pressure point. If someone knows that you fear appearing unfair, they may suggest that you have been unfair. If someone knows that you fear appearing selfish, they may imply selfishness. If someone knows you fear disappointing them, they may use disappointment as a tool. And it all starts with something very small. A reaction. One moment. A moment when you revealed more than you imagined. Because while you were trying to resolve a conversation, someone might just be watching how you react when you need to defend who you are. There is a specific moment in many manipulative relationships that passes completely unnoticed. This is not when the control begins. This is when he is tested for the second time. Because the first test is to observe. The second test serves to confirm. And this is where the pattern begins to reveal itself. Imagine someone who, a few days ago, made a slightly unfair comment about you. Something small, almost insignificant. You reacted by explaining, trying to clarify, maybe even trying to show that it was not what the person was suggesting. The conversation ended. It seems like everything is back to normal, but then, days later, something similar appears. Another comment, another little tease. Another situation where you need to explain something, and many people see this as a coincidence. But for those who observe human behavior strategically, this can be simply continuation of the experiment, because manipulators learn something very early. Small pressures reveal much more about someone than direct questions. If I ask, "Do you have limits?" most people will say yes, but if I subtly cross a line, the reaction will show the truth. This is why tests rarely look like attacks. They seem like ordinary interactions. A review here, a charge there, a joke that crosses a bit of respect. Nothing big, nothing scandalous, just small measurements of emotional territory. Now watch what usually happens next. Whether the first reaction was conciliatory, explanatory, or defensive, the second test it usually comes a little bolder. Not brutal, just a little more invasive. Perhaps a request that slightly exceeds your comfort. Perhaps a slightly more direct criticism. Perhaps an expectation placed on you without having been agreed upon. And then again, the person observes. This is the default. Tease, observe, adjust, next. But there is something even more subtle happening in this process. Often the manipulator mixes positive signals with small intrusions. At one point he can be extremely likable, attentive, almost charming. At another moment an unexpected criticism appears, or a strange charge, or a blame placed in the air. This alternation is not always conscious, but it has a very powerful psychological effect. Confuses. Because when someone is constantly aggressive, it's easy to recognize the problem. But when a person alternates between gentleness and pressure, the mind begins to doubt the own perception. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe I misinterpreted it. And while you try to understand what happened, the other person continues to observe your reactions. Because the question she is silently answering is simple. How far will this person give in to keep the relationship comfortable? This is the central point. Manipulation rarely starts with trying to dominate someone. It starts by trying to understand what emotional cost you are willing to pay to keep the peace. And here something fascinating happens from a psychological point of view. Many people believe they are being patient, understanding, mature. But what the manipulator may be seeing is something else. Increasing tolerance. And growing tolerance for those who test limits is a silent invitation. Imagine someone who makes an inconvenient request. You accept. Then comes another request. A little bigger. You accept again. Not because he wants to, but because you don't want to seem difficult, or selfish, or ungrateful. Now notice the cold logic of this. Each acceptance creates a new reference. What once seemed like too much to ask now seems normal, because you already accepted it once. And if you accepted it before, maybe you'll accept it again. Thus, the limits are moved millimeter by millimeter, almost imperceptibly. It's not a push, it's a slide. And this happens in many relationships. Loving relationships, work environments, old friendships, family dynamics. It always starts small. It always starts with something that seems easy to ignore. But each small reaction tells the other person something very specific. How much do you resist? How much you explain yourself? How much you try to maintain harmony? And most importantly, how much discomfort you tolerate to avoid conflict. When this pattern becomes clear to those testing, the next step is rarely random. It is adjusted based on everything your reactions have revealed up to that point. There is a point in this process when most people begin to feel something strange. Not necessarily a big warning, but an uncomfortable feeling. as if small situations started to repeat themselves. A review here, a charge there, an expectation placed on you without actually being agreed upon. Nothing that seems clearly abusive, but something starts to take its toll. And the curious thing is that often the weight doesn't come from the other person's words. It comes from the way you react. Because that's when the mechanism starts to show its true strength. Efficient manipulation rarely depends on direct attacks. It depends on predictable reactions, and these reactions are almost always emotional. Embarrassed silence, low look, nervous laughter to lighten the mood, attempts to explain something that no one really asked for an explanation for, apologies that come automatically. Maybe you've already done this. Someone says something that seems slightly unfair, and before you even think about it, you're already trying to correct the situation, trying to show that I didn't mean it, trying to prove that it wasn't your intention, trying to make it clear that you are not the type of person who would do that. It just seems like defense. But for anyone watching, this reveals something very specific. It reveals how much the image that others have of you can affect your behavior. And this makes room for something extremely powerful within the manipulative dynamic. Anticipated guilt. There is no need to accuse directly. Just insinuate. An ambiguous sentence. A comment full of disappointment. A sigh. And, if the other person reacts by trying to repair something that wasn't even clearly pointed out, the mechanism begins to consolidate. Now, one of psychological detail that tends to surprise many people. Research on social behavior shows that humans have a tendency very strong at restoring harmony in interactions. When we feel that someone is disappointed in us, our immediate impulse is often to, sometimes it's trying to correct that. Explain. Compensate. Repair. This is part of human social nature. But in manipulative contexts, this tendency can be exploited. Because those who manipulate learn to provoke small emotional fissures, not to solve the problem, but to observe how you react to the feeling of having done something wrong. If your reaction is defensive, the person adjusts. If your reaction is conciliatory, the person learns. If your reaction is to blame, then the pattern begins to repeat itself. Now stop for a moment. How many times have you apologized before you even understood exactly why? Were you apologizing? How many times have you tried to explain something that no one asked you to explain? How many times have you taken emotional responsibility for a situation that seemed confused, just to avoid tension? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations to perception, because manipulators pay attention precisely at these moments. They watch who tries to restore emotional balance to the conversation, who tries to resolve discomfort quickly, who tries to ensure that everything returns to normal as quickly as possible. And there is a specific behavior that attracts the attention of those who manipulate. The person who accepts small injustices to keep the peace, not because she doesn't see the injustice, but because confronting it seems more exhausting than swallowing it. This is fertile ground for manipulative dynamics, because every small injustice tolerated creates a precedent. Each silence creates space. Each over-explanation creates openness, and little by little something changes within the relationship. You start to feel like you need to tread carefully, choose words, avoid certain reactions, don't create problems. This is where normality begins to break down, because healthy relationships don't require a person to constantly manage the climate, emotional to avoid displeasing the other. But when manipulation comes into play, it becomes part of the dynamic. And the most disturbing thing is that all this can happen without major confrontations. No screaming, no threats. Just small tensions repeated over time, each one watched closely, each reaction recorded. Because for those who manipulate well, the objective was never just to win an argument. The goal has always been to discover what reaction of yours appears when you feel you need it, prove that it is not the problem. Until now, many people still imagine this dynamic happening only in relationships obviously toxic, problematic romantic relationships, abusive bosses, clearly unbalanced friendships. But the psychological reality is more uncomfortable. The most effective social manipulation rarely happens in environments where everyone realizes that something is wrong. It flourishes precisely in places where everything seems normal, functional environments, educated people, seemingly ordinary conversations, families that on the outside seem perfectly structured, because well-adapted social manipulators do not present themselves as predators. They present themselves as nice people, considerate, reliable. Sometimes I even eat very sensitive people, and this is exactly what makes the process so difficult to identify. You don't expect someone who shows care, interest, or closeness to be also observing their reactions with strategic attention. But in many cases, it is. Now imagine a very common situation. Someone close to you makes a comment that seems to mix concern with criticism. Something like, "I just think sometimes you overcomplicate things." The tone is not aggressive. The phrase even seems kind, but it carries a little emotional pressure, because now you feel like you need to explain, or justify, or prove that it is not exactly what was suggested. And while you do this, the person watches. But here we need to change perspective for a moment. Get out of the position of the person reacting. Enter for a few seconds into the mind of the observer. Imagine someone who has learned throughout their life that relationships are a game of influence. Not necessarily a cruel game, but a position game. Who gives in? Who confronts? Who avoids conflict? Who tries to please? For someone who thinks like this, social interactions are like a terrain in constant reading. Every conversation reveals something. Each reaction delivers information. If I make a critical comment and the person immediately tries to explain, that shows something. If I show disappointment and the person tries to make up for it, that shows me something. If I invade a small boundary and the person pretends not to notice, that shows me something even clearer. This type of reading does not need to be completely conscious. Sometimes it's almost instinctive, a mental habit built over years of observing human behavior. And the result of this is disturbing, because socially well-adjusted manipulators don't seem manipulative. They seem like extremely perceptive people, people who understand others, people who know exactly what to say in every situation. And this is often true. They really understand, but they understand it in a strategic way. While many people enter interactions seeking connection, they come in looking to read, and reading happens all the time. Your enthusiasm, your silence, your need for approval, your discomfort when the conversation becomes tense. All of this becomes material for interpretation. And this doesn't just happen in intimate relationships. It can happen at work, in social circles, in old friendships, even in family environments where certain emotional roles have already been established for years. Maybe you've met someone who always seems to know exactly where to touch in a conversation. The person who makes a comment that makes you slightly uncomfortable, but isn't serious enough to confront. The person who puts an expectation in the air, without actually asking for something directly. The person who watches your reactions with quiet interest. These interactions are strange because they straddle the border between normal and uncomfortable. Nothing seems wrong enough to warrant direct confrontation, but something doesn't quite add up. And it is precisely in this ambiguous territory that the most refined manipulation takes place. Because when something is clearly aggressive, you react. But when something is just mildly uncomfortable, many people try to ignore it, or soften, or explain. And each of these reactions offers exactly what the manipulator is looking for: information, a detailed emotional map, a progressive understanding of which doors are open, and which ports still need to be tested with a little more pressure. There is a very specific moment in every manipulative dynamic, an instant that almost no one notices when it's happening. This is not when the manipulation begins, nor is it when it is already fully established. It is the moment when your reaction stops being just spontaneous and becomes advanced. You start to feel it in a subtle way. Before the other person even finishes a sentence, your body is already prepared to respond in a certain way. Maybe explain, maybe soften, maybe partially agree to avoid tension, maybe apologize. Not because you believe you did something wrong, but because in that emotional environment, it seems safer to keep the conversation steady. This is the critical moment, because when your reactions start to be predictable, they stop being just reactions. They become tools within the dynamics of the relationship. Manipulators don't need to control every word. They just need to know the emotional buttons that make you act in certain ways. Shape. And those buttons are almost always constructed from deeply human things. Desire to be fair, fear of appearing selfish, desire to maintain harmony. I'm afraid of disappointing. Positive values can become predictable pressure points. Now notice something interesting. Manipulative people rarely press these points directly. They do this indirectly. A comment that suggests selfishness, a silence that suggests disapproval, an expression of disappointment. And that is often enough, because the reaction happens automatically. You try to correct the perception, explain better, show that it wasn't that. And at that moment something silent happens. The other person realizes they have found a working button. This does not mean that every gesture was planned with absolute coldness, but it does mean that the behavior starts to repeat itself, because it works. Now imagine this happening over time. Whenever a small conflict arises, you try to resolve it quickly. Whenever tension appears, you try to relieve it. Whenever a criticism comes up, you try to explain it. Little by little, the dynamics of the relationship are organized around these responses. The other person provokes. You adjust. The other person presses. You soften. The other person watches. And so the pattern stabilizes. Here's the phrase that a lot of people need to hear, even if it's uncomfortable. Efficient manipulation depends much more on the predictability of the victim's reaction than on the manipulator intelligence. When someone knows exactly how you react under emotional pressure, control makes it much easier, because there is no need to force anything. Just press the right point and wait. But this is also exactly where something can change, because when you begin to notice the instant your reaction arises, the dynamic starts to change. It is not necessary to create immediate confrontation. No big speeches. Sometimes change starts with something extremely simple. A second of silence, a pause before explaining, a conscious decision not to immediately correct the other person's perception. This small space changes everything, because the manipulator relies on automatic reaction. When the reaction doesn't come as expected, the experiment fails. The reading is incomplete. Predictability disappears, and the dynamics need to be recalculated. This is why psychological awareness is so powerful. Not because it turns you into someone cold or distant, but because it gives back something that many people lose without realizing it within relationships manipulators. The choice about how to react. And there is an important warning here. The minute you start reacting differently, some people will strange, because the pattern that worked before stops working. The quick explanation does not appear. The attempt to repair does not come immediately. Predictability disappears, and when that happens, the dynamics of the relationship reveal themselves in a much clearer way. Because some people adapt to the new balance, but others show for the first time how much they depended on their predictable reactions to continue moving forward. At the end of the day, manipulation doesn't just depend on what someone says to you. It depends on what your reactions teach about you. This is the detail that completely changes the way we see certain interactions. Because when you start to notice this pattern, many situations in the past start to make more sense. That conversation where you left feeling awkward, even though you didn't know exactly why. That person who always seemed to know exactly what to say to provoke your explanation. That relationship where, little by little, you started to feel like you needed to measure up their own reactions. Nothing seemed overtly aggressive, but something was being tested all the time. And when you look back more clearly, you notice a curious detail. Things rarely started out big. They almost always started small. A cross-comment. A provocation disguised as humor. A criticism that sounded like concern. An expectation placed in the air without having actually been agreed upon. And in each of these situations, something silent happened. His reaction was observed, registered, interpreted. Because for those who manipulate relationships, the central question has never been simply, how convince this person? The real question has always been something else. How does this person react when they feel emotional pressure? If the reaction is confrontation, the approach changes. If the reaction is silence, the strategy changes. If reaction is explanation, then there is a clear path. That's why manipulators pay so much attention to a detail that most people ignore. The first moment after something uncomfortable happens, that little moment when you decide how to react, because there appears something much more revealing than any speech, your emotional tendency. Now there is an important reflection here. We all react emotionally. We all want to be understood. We all feel uncomfortable when someone suggests that we have done something wrong. This is part of the human experience. The problem is not in the reaction itself. The problem begins when someone learns to provoke these reactions deliberately, when small stimuli are used repeatedly to find out how far you will give in, as far as you explain, how far you try to maintain harmony. To what extent do you accept carrying a little more emotional responsibility than should? This is how certain relationships take shape over time, not with big confrontations, but with small adjustments based on your answers. And here, there is a change of perspective that can completely transform the way how you see certain people. Instead of just asking, "What did this person mean?" there is a further question more revealing. What was this person observing in my reaction? This question changes everything, because often the phrase said was just the stimulus. The reaction was the real goal. And when you start to realize this, something interesting happens. You start to notice pauses, looks, silences, those seconds when someone seems to watch you after you say something, as if he was waiting for something. Maybe you've never paid attention to this before, but once you realize it, it's hard not to see it, because social manipulators don't just pay attention to what you say. They pay attention when you feel pressured to prove who you are. It is at this moment that many people reveal more than they imagine. Now imagine the effect of a small change. Instead of reacting automatically, you watch, you breathe, you let the sentence exist in the environment for a few seconds without explaining, without justifying, without trying to immediately restore balance to the conversation. This small psychological space can be extremely revealing, because when the automatic reaction disappears, the entire dynamic of the interaction changes. Some people just carry on with the conversation as normal, but others demonstrate something curious: discomfort, impatience, or a quick attempt to provoke another reaction. And that reveals something important, that maybe that sentence was never just a sentence. Maybe it was a test. Because at the end of the day, manipulators continue to advance only when they discover that there is room to move forward. And often this space appears in such a small moment that almost no one understands. A look that lowers, an explanation that comes too quickly, an apology that appears before there is even an accusation. It's seconds, but it's seconds that teach a lot. So the next time someone says something that provokes an immediate reaction in you, maybe it's worth paying attention to one detail, not just in what was said, but in those who are watching your reaction. Because sometimes the conversation that's happening isn't really about words. It's about finding out how far you will allow someone into your mind without asking permission. And when you start to realize this, some people stop looking just difficult. They start to seem extremely attentive to your reactions. And perhaps the most important question is not who is manipulating, but something much quieter: who is learning about you every time you react without realizing it.